Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of GeoSpace.
I'm your host, Mohammed Salih. Glad to have you with us for another edition of GeoSpace, the New Regions bi-weekly podcast where we explore the shifting dynamics of Middle Eastern politics. Today, I'm truly delighted to be joined by Dr. Joshua Landis. Joshua is the Sandra Mackey Chair and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Oklahoma's Boren College of International Studies. He's a leading expert on Syria and has written prolifically on the country's politics, society, and foreign relations. Among his publications is The Syrian Opposition, The Struggle for Unity and Relevance, a book he co-authored with GeoSpace in 2009. In this episode, we will be focusing on the current situation in Syria, particularly the evolving and deeply complex conditions in Suwayda, a province in southern Syria, and what that reveals about the broader minority question in Syria. From questions of political identity and statehood to the lived realities of sectarian dynamics in Syria, we will explore what these developments mean for the future of the country. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder, you can find GeoSpace on the New Regions website under the Watch section, and we are also on YouTube and SoundCloud. And if you are interested in diving deeper, I've written a number of pieces on the New Regions website, analyzing both the recent violence in Syria and the larger developments over the past few months in the country. Joshua, welcome to GeoSpace. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure being with you, Mohammed.
Thank you. Let me start with Suwayda. So we recently saw a spate of violence in Suwayda, a Druze majority province in southern Syria. According to some estimates, over 1,200 people were killed in the clashes. We have seen gruesome footage emerging showing executions and abuse of Druze civilians at the hands of government forces or allied Sunni tribal militias. A few hundred government and pro-government fighters were also killed, including some Bedouin tribesmen who were killed by Druze fighters. This followed an earlier wave of violence in the Alawite majority coastal areas of the country back in March, where nearly 1,500, mostly civilians, were killed. A lot of them just executed on the spot by government or pro-government forces. So, there has been a lot of debate about what's really going on in Suwayda, with various interpretations in circulation. Is this really a case of a minority resisting an oppressive state or a power struggle between a weakened central government and a defiant province? Are we witnessing remnants of an old regime pushing back against a revolutionary order? Or as some, claim, is it a clash between some individuals involved in illegal narcotic activities and a law and order type of a state? What's your read on all of this?
Well, your first two, I think, are the primary importance, and that is the desire of the new al-Sharaa government in Damascus to centralize. Clearly, there is that element of a recalcitrant minority in the provinces that does not want to give up its guns. Secondly, there is a clash of ideas and religions. The Druze minority belongs to a heterodox Shiite sect that is considered to be unbelievers by the Salafi authorities, the new authorities that used to be Nusra, that have, that al-Qaeda in Syria, have evolved to a certain degree, but have taken over Damascus. And so the Druze, who are considered to be murtaddin, who are considered to be apostates by the Salafi Muslims, are frightened, and they're fearful of letting go of their guns and giving them up to the state. Because the Alawite minority, which lives on the coast, the other side of Syria, there were large massacres carried out, and somewhere about 2,500 Alawites were killed. And so the Druze look at that, and they look at previous experiences that they've had with Sharaa and Nusra, where Druze were killed and their shrines were blown up. And they said, we don't trust you. You've taken all the power, and you're not giving us any power. We want some form of federal decentralized government. And that's the struggle. The state has tended to see this as a recalcitrant minority that is just wants to keep its guns, and that is willing to work with Israel against the nation, and is now calling them traitors to Syria because Israel, of course, entered into this. So it's both of those things.
Right. There's also a narrative in Syria, at least among some, that that the Druze and the Kurds were somehow collaborators with the Assad regime simply because they didn't either join the uprising, or they didn't join it as forcefully, let's say, as many Sunni Arabs did, and they also blamed the Alawites, for being basically the sect from which the ruling Assad family came that ruled the country for over half a century. How accurate is this type of narrative, and what it really means for the place and position of minorities in new Syria post-Assad?
Well, it's correct. There is nothing wrong with that narrative. The question is, how do you build a stable nation today? And the narrative is that the regime led by Hafez al-Assad and then his son Bashar al-Assad was a minoritarian regime. And it was. I mean, it's hard to get around that. Now, defenders of the regime say that most people in the army were Sunnis and so forth. And that is true. Assad had to make deals with Sunni leaders in order to stabilize Syria, and he allowed the Sunnis a predominant role in the economy, which they had anyway, but he allowed them to continue it. And there were many Sunnis in the top positions of the government, but the essential security state, the top 40 generals in the Syrian army, for example, were all Alawite in the last 5 years of this war. The top heads of security were mostly Alawite. There was one Sunni, but he didn't have any power of his own. So the security state was built on sectarian, tribal, family loyalties, which were the only loyalties that Assad discovered could stabilize Syria. As you said, Syria from 1949, when you had 3 coups, to 1970, when Assad took over, had over 20 coups or coup attempts. It was the banana republic of the Middle East, great instability. Assad stabilized it in the name of Arab nationalism and equality amongst Arabs by using traditional values, tribe, sect, family members. And in many ways, Sharaa is doing exactly the same thing today. And his accusation, the widespread accusation that Sunni Arabs can't trust the minorities because they're untrustworthy. They're a fifth column. They're working for foreign powers. They don't have the best intentions of Syria at heart or of the new government, and are unwilling to give up sovereignty to the new state. There's an element of truth in all of that. And the question then is, should the new government destroy the minorities and take their guns away and put their foot on their throats the way Assad used to do? Or should it try to build a new form of government that's based on a new social contract? Is that possible? In which there is power sharing. And of course, that's what the minorities are asking for. But the Sharaa government doesn't trust them as far as he can throw them. So he's not going to do that. At least I cannot foresee it.
Right. I think we should also, point out that at least in the Kurdish parts of Syria, there was also, a quite significant participation, among the locals in the earliest stages of the 2011 uprising when it emerged. And that was the case more or less, until the uprising turned into an armed conflict between sections of the opposition and the Assad regime. And, took on an increasingly also sectarian character that pitted the Sunni Arabs against the Alawite-dominated regime of Bashar al-Assad. So, I think I said that to basically point out that, we have a history that actually also just goes back to, if we don't want to go very far back in time to the French Mandate era where, the Druze had a state of their own for a while. The Alawites did, and the state did not have that level of centralized control over minority
Provinces.
communities.
Yes, and the Kurd. If I can interrupt you, the Kurdish relationship to the central state has always been a delicate affair, because the Kurds, of course, have their own language, they're their own ethnicity. They lived in the northeast, but there were many Arabized Kurds. That's what they're called, is Arabized Kurds, who lived in the major cities, the Barazis, the many major families in Syrian history are Kurdish. Of course, Salah ad-Din and others are Kurds that we know of. So there's a big variety of Kurds, but the majority of Kurds live in the northeast and are about 10% of the population. As Kurdish, well, the French naturalized a lot of Kurds into Syria that fled from Turkey, because if you recall, there's Said rebellion in 26, there's a series of rebellions in Turkey that were for various reasons against Ataturk and his centralizing mission. And he pulverized these tribes and the Kurds and drove many of them into Syria, where they fled. And the French gave them nationality in Syria. France was, I don't know if it was happy to, but it did. And then when independence came along, the Kurds were sitting in Syria. And of course, Syria was called a Syrian Arab Republic. And it was based on Arab nationalism. And the Kurds were looked down on. They were discriminated against. They were poor. And they were really marginalized in Syrian history, the northeastern Kurds. Then there was great development in the 1950s in the Jazeera area. That's the area that's up in the northeast, north of the Euphrates River. Tons of fertile land, sparsely populated, tribes, both Arab and Kurdish tribes, but poor. And with the two things, tractors, Ford tractors, and water pumps that spread throughout the entire Jazeera area and the Euphrates Basin, Khabur, there was a giant boom. And Jazeera became the engine of economic growth in Syria. And the Aleppans were largely running this economic operation. They had the money, they invested, they bought land, and both Kurdish tribes and Arab tribes were marginalized increasingly and sold their land or were pushed off the land. And the urban people took over. And this has been a tension in this northeast area between the urban part and the tribes, both Kurds and Arabs, and then a struggle between the Arab tribes and the Kurdish tribes for land. And as the Kurds became more and more nationalistic and organized and educated, they embraced various forms of Kurdish nationalism. such as Öcalan's PKK. And Assad, the father Assad, Hafs of Assad, embraced Öcalan in the 70s, brought him to Damascus, helped him organize his offices, and allowed him to organize Kurds in the northeast of Syria to use as a hammer against Turkey. Because Turkey had taken Iskenderun, a whole province in the west. Turkey was taking Syria's water, building the Gap Dam, almost 30 dams to take Tigris and Euphrates water that Syria thought was theirs. So Assad's idea was, let's use the Kurds and Kurdish nationalism to hurt Turkey and get a better negotiating position. Of course, this produced tons of Turkish-Syrian enmity, but it did draw the Kurds in on the side of the Assad regime. And to a certain degree, Assad was happy with that because he was running a minoritarian regime and he needed minority support. And he needed the Kurds to balance the Arab tribes in the northeast, who were not big fans of the Assad regime. Some tribes were, but increasingly they were left behind. They were poor. They were ignored. The oil, which was in the northeast, was not given to the tribes. So they were unhappy. And that produced lots of tensions.
Right. At the same time, as Assad was doing all of that and provided some space for the PKK and the Kurds in Syria affiliated with the PKK, to operate, there was also, this constant, regime of discrimination, right, and marginalization of Kurds.
Arab nationalism. Yes, there was the Hizam al-Akhdar, the Green Belt. Assad was putting Arabs up there, trying to weaken the Turkish majority in areas near Hasakeh and so forth, Qamishli and so forth. Yes, it was a tense situation because Assad didn't want the Kurds to be Kurdish nationalists. And he would suppress Nowruz, and there was always fighting around Nowruz because the Kurds would all celebrate Nowruz as an expression of Kurdish national identity, and he would smash them. And it was a constant headache of him trying to, and I'll never forget when I was living in Damascus in 2005, for example, there were Kurdish fruit sellers who would come with their carts and park in front of my apartment. And they would be selling, sabra, they would be selling, all kinds of fruits. And you would see the guards and the soldiers come by and humiliate these guys. And they didn't push over their carts, but they would throw some fruit away. And they would have to give them some money because they were Kurds. They were, didn't have a license for their cart. It was so painful to watch this. And it would happen over and over again, just outside your window. And everybody in the neighborhood could see it. But that's what happened to Kurds. They had to keep their head down and they had to kiss the hand of the regime. So yes, there was constant humiliation, but they had a role as well. And they were given certain privileges. The head of, the Mufti, Grand Mufti of Syria was Kurdish. He used the Kurds in many different ways and gave them some prominent positions. And that the Assads did. And that kept them under the tent, put it that way. And then when the uprising started in 2011, very quickly, Assad had to bring his troops to the major cities, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, Damascus, because they were falling out of control. So he withdrew all of his troops from eastern Syria, from the Kurdish region, and he essentially handed it over to the PKK, not the PKK, a YPG, but to his Kurdish allies, because he didn't want the Arab tribes to rule it, because they were going to join the Syrian opposition. That was really dangerous. So he'd prefer the Kurds to the Arabs. And that's why many of the Arabs, even though the Kurds were happy to get rid of Assad, they didn't like Assad. They wanted autonomy. They wanted to rule the Northeast. They were still enemies of the Arab tribes who also wanted to rule and saw it as their chance. And many of them joined Nusra, and Nusra took over Deir ez-Zor and the major cities on the Euphrates by 2013. And then ISIS came in and kicked them all out and took over. And many of the Arab tribes joined ISIS. And ISIS, of course, wanted to drive out the Kurds and began to attack Kobani and all of these. Al-Qaeda had already been doing it with the tribes, but ISIS did it with a vengeance. And all the cities along the Khabur, the Assyrians, Kurdish towns, they were being driven out. Kobani was being destroyed by ISIS, and Turkey was clapping the whole time through and helping ISIS and allowed ISIS troops to come through Turkey and attack them from behind. It was a scandal. And so the Kurds very quickly realized that they were in a dangerous situation.
Joshua, let's get well. Thank you for that. First of all, for that historical overview. Let's get to the record of the current president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, the transitional president in Syria. He has had multiple opportunities since coming to power in early December, or officially in early January. He has had multiple opportunities to demonstrate goodwill toward and respect for minority rights, whether through the constitutional declaration or, through the government's handling of the unrest in minority areas, as in the coastal areas, and more recently in Suwayda, and through government appointments. However, what we have seen, the record really has not in any way been up to the expectations and aspirations of the minority communities. For example, the constitutional declaration in its Article 3 said that the state protects divine religions, which naturally, given his background as a Salafi jihadist, raises the very legitimate question of whether, he and his government and the powerful people around him consider the Druze, the Alawites, or the Yazidis as some sort of divine religion. How do they perceive and define these communities? And Article 1 of that constitution calls Syria the Syrian Arab Republic, just in the way that the Assads did, and before them during the United Arab Republic, the union between Egypt and Syria, when the word Arab, I think, for the first time was put in the official title of the state of Syria. So, given all this, given the violence, given the the lack of clear recognition in the constitutional declaration and the marginalization of these communities in various ways, what does all of this really tell us about the approach of Shar'a's government and the new Syria that he's going, to build? Is it going to be a place for all Syrians, based on some, form of inclusive Syrian patriotism, or is it really going to be mainly a Sunni and Arab state?
Well, I think the short answer is it's going to be a Sunni Arab state. That seems to be all the indications. And, when Sharaa first took over Idlib in 2016, he spoke to his people of Idlib that he was there to defend Sunni Arabs. And this was going to be a Sunni Arab enclave. And the Christians all fled within 48 hours that were part of Idlib. The Druze got battered and many fled, but not all. And it became a Sunni Arab place. Now that he's in Damascus, the language isn't quite so sectarian. It's the Umayyad. They're bringing back the Umayyad glory of Syria, when Syria was the capital of the Islamic Empire. early Islamic empire for 100 years before the Abbasids took it. And that, it makes sense if you're a Sunni Arab, because Damascus was the capital of the Umayyad Empire. It ruled over the entire Middle East. It's glorious. It's like Erdogan invoking the Ottoman Empire and resurrecting it. So for nationalist purposes, for Arab purposes, it makes complete sense. But for Syria's minorities, it's terrifying, because the Umayyads were the ones who fought the Shia, who suppressed, Yazid and so forth. I mean, there's just a long history of bad will. And of course, it's not good for the Kurds because it's very Arab. And it's very Islamic in a way that the YPG is trying to get away from a more Salafi interpretation of Islam. So it's scary for Syria's minorities, no doubt about it.
Right. Let's talk about, the vision that the minorities have for the structure of the state of Syria. Many minorities, as the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawites, are advocating for some sort of decentralization. And at the same time, we see that the Sunni Arab elites insist really on a centralized state. And Sharaa is, reflecting that collective Sunni will at the helm of power today in Damascus. What kind of Syria is actually viable in the long run? You are a scholar, who is very well familiar with the country. And we have also seen, the experience of a centralized unitary state in Syria for about, past 6 or 7 decades, 8 decades. What kind of model of a statehood, of rule really is going to work for Syria, given the history of the country and the, current circumstances that we are seeing?
Well, I can tell you what some people are proposing, and then I can tell you what I think will happen, which are two very different things. One, I just was writing about this proposal put forward by Jude, a guy who is living in Damascus now, but he claims to be the founder and head of the nation-building movement in Syria. Arab Sunni, but liberal, Western educated. And he writes that there's two models. There's the federal system. There's what Israel wants, which is to keep Syria broken and weak, and to encourage this federal system of real independence for all the minorities. He said, which will lead to the sort of collapse of the state. And there's this system, there's the model that Sharaa is putting forward, which is to unify all of Syria by force and to bring central sovereignty over the provinces. He says both of those, ironically, are going to lead to the same thing, which is a disintegration of Syria. And so what he calls for, which makes a lot of sense, is for a new social contract, he calls it, a new social contract in which all Syrians have a role to play and are equal and come together some kind of democratic outcome where they get to vote and have representatives and a parliament that really has power where they can protect themselves and be represented and make the laws. And the president doesn't have all the power. Now, that's a beautiful model. I would like to be able to say I think it's realistic, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think everything we've seen so far is that the social forces in Syria, all the militias, the new Syrian military, and the men around Sharaa all believe that force is the best way forward. And I think they will succeed. I don't think Syria will fall apart. I think they will smash the minorities, put them under their foot, and it'll just be a new Syria much like the old, but with a shoe on the other foot, with the Sunni Arabs and Sabat al-Jaysh al-Raqbat al-Nas, where the shoe of the army is on the throats of the people, which is what you people all used to complain about under Assad. But I've got to say, in favor of that model, if I can be so crass and really sarcastic in some ways, is that 70% of Syrians are Sunni Arab. And before, the Jaysh represented 30% who were minorities, and some secular Sunnis, and of course there were Sunni supporters and the merchant class and so forth. But the point is that the state under Assad had to be extra brutal because it was a minoritarian state. Under Sharaa, many Sunni Arabs and many secularish Sunni Arabs see him as a savior, as someone who's returned Syria to its rightful owners, because they see themselves as rightful owners. Many do, not all. And they thought Assad had won. After 14 years of bloody, brutal civil war, they'd given up hope. And then, miracle of all miracles, Sharaa walks into Damascus, the regime collapses overnight, and he's a hero. And he has tremendous revolutionary legitimacy, if we can call it that, because he did what nobody thought was possible. And that gives him a ton of legitimacy and a credibility, but he's also got the army. And on top of that, shul badil, what is the alternative? That's what America is asking. That's what Europe is asking. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all these countries that have embraced Sharaa said there's no alternative. They say, wake up, Syrians. Wake up, world. You may not like this guy because he's ex-Al-Qaeda and he's a Salafist, he's going to be a little bit brutal. But if he falls, Syria is going to be civil war. It's going to be chaos. There is nobody who's known beside him. All these forces will be fighting each other, and it'll be much worse violence. So that keeps the international community embracing him. That's why Saudi Arabia just promised him $6 billion. That's why America is blowing kisses in his direction. And Barak says, America's ambassador to Turkey and envoy to Syria says federalism doesn't work. And that's what the minorities want, is some form of federalism. And America has just told the minorities, you're not going to get it. We support Sharaa taking central power. And in a sense, he's told the Kurds, we're leaving. We're supporting Sharaa. You have to make a deal with him, whether it's a good deal or a bad deal. We prefer it to be a good deal, but it might be a bad deal. And Mazloum Abdi, was very, I think, is very worried.
Definitely. Let's talk a little bit about the U.S. position here. The U.S., is of course very much engaged in shaping the post-Assad order in Syria. But it also seems, or at least the U.S. position has come under criticism from, political representatives of the minority groups for being out of touch with the reality of the country on the ground. Do you think that Washington's approach to post-Assad Syria is strategically sound? Or are they, chasing goals that don't simply really align with Syria's complex political geography, history, and, the present circumstances that we see in the country?
Well, that's an excellent question. And it's a very hard one to answer because I have been a consistent critic of U.S. foreign policy towards Syria for the last 25 years, 30 years. Because the U.S. is pursuing regime change. And whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Afghanistan, Libya, it's brought very bad results. America has destroyed whatever state was there in these countries without a viable alternative. And those have launched terrible civil wars in every single country. those regime change. Very brutal. Lots of refugees. So when Trump said, we're not going to do nation building, it's finished for us in the Middle East, we want to get out. He implied that Syria is not that important, and he's going to listen to Turkey and the King of Saudi Arabia, our two closest regional allies other than Israel. And I'm going to let Sharaa be Sharaa, right? Let the Syrians be the Syrians and then give them a chance, lift sanctions, no conditions, do it. And personally, I think that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think it's going too far to the other side, because having some conditions about power sharing would have possibly avoided what happened in the Jebel Druze and saved lives. But it's not clear that that was going to happen. Sharaa might have done it anyway. I think Sharaa feels very confident that he is the only viable ruler. And just the way Assad thought that there was no alternative to him except for crazy Islamists, and that he could always turn to the West and say, Shur al-Badil, what's the alternative? You've got me, it's better than the Muslim Brotherhood. And he thought that would always win for him. And it did for 60 years or 50 years. It won for the Assads. Thomas Friedman, after 1982 Hama uprising, when many Syrians were killed by the regime and putting down this Muslim Brotherhood uprising, Thomas Friedman wrote an op-ed and saying, well, it's better that Assad should win than the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the same attitude that Damascus is receiving today from Thomas Baddock. And I understand it, but in many ways it's gone too far by saying we're not going to support democracy, we're not going to support any kind of minority rights, and we're going to let him do what he wants. And that's given him a carte blanche to be very brutal. And I think it'll continue that way.
Right. One thing that, I personally tend to believe a lot of people are, ignoring the close connections of Syria's domestic politics with regional geopolitical rivalries, and how these broader regional rivalries come really to affect and shape, the trajectory of the state from here on. And I think, we saw that most tangibly in the case of Suwayda, with the government troops, security forces going into the province after the, earlier clashes between the Druze factions and some local Sunni Bedouin tribes in that part of the country. Sharaa might have thought that, especially, given the, very publicly vocal and supportive statements coming from the US, that it was going to be more or less an easy or doable task for him to take over Suwayda and impose state's control over that province. But the connection of Suwayda and the Druze there to Israel really, came to play a role that was not probably seen as clearly either by Sharaa or by some of his backers in the West or in the country. Do you think, given this reality that we have, and it's not only with Suwayda, the Druze and Israel, but also in the Northeast in Rojava, with the SDF and the Kurds also, neighboring Iraq and sort of having this advantage of probably receiving, some sort of assistance from Iran and pro-Iranian groups inside Iraq. Do you think that, this whole notion or idea of thinking or tending to think that that Sharaa could reestablish centralized control over all Syrian territory without making some sort of meaningful concession that would secure the buy-in of these minorities, that sort of vision is really going to be dangerous and is a recipe for further violence and potentially the failure of the state, because Damascus is not really powerful at the moment.
I think you're. I think it is powerful. I think it is powerful. I think that sure, it's not powerful compared to Israel, and we saw that Israel could jump in on the side of the Druze and protect them. And Israel bombed the Ministry of Defense. It told Turkey first. It informed Turkey that it was going to bomb the Ministry of Defense, and Turkey immediately called up Sharaa and said, "Get all the people out of the Ministry of Defense." And then Israel bombed it and threatened to bomb the presidential palace next if he didn't withdraw his troops. So he did. He was forced to withdraw his troops. I think he miscalculated and believed that America had given him carte blanche to centralize, and that what he had done on the coast to the Alawites could be done with the Jebel Druze, because they're even small. They're only 3% of Syria, not 12% as the Alawites are. But he was wrong, because Israel defied America and said, screw you to Trump and Barak, and said, we're going to bomb this guy. And, Sharaa made the same mistake that many people in the Middle East have made, and think that America calls the tune and Israel has to follow. And that's just a wrong calculation, as we've seen. We won't get into, American politics, but domestically, it just doesn't work that way. And so America had to let Israel bomb, and it tisk-tisked. But as Barak said afterwards, we can't force Israel to do anything. And I think he's quite right. So Sharaa made a mistake. Israel is protecting the Druze, but it can't really protect the Druze, because, Netanyahu early on warned Sharaa not to move any troops south of Damascus, because he didn't want Sharaa's government on his border. He said Sharaa is a bad guy. He's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda don't change their spots. And anyway, he's allied with Turkey, and we don't like Turkey. Turkey has helped has helped Hamas and invited Hamas leaders. And Turkey's a worse power than Iran, the new big enemy. And we don't want their army anywhere near us. So Netanyahu laid down the law and said, we're going to protect the Druze. The trouble is, he can't really protect them. He could do that this time, but he's not going to move his troops up to the Jebel Druze, because in between the Jebel Druze and the Golan Heights, which Israel occupies, is Deraa and the Haran, which is, Deraa is a big Arab city, and he would have to take it. And then he would own, hundreds of thousands of more Arabs, which is exactly what he doesn't want to do. He's already choking on his Arabs. And so he's not going to conquer Jebel Druze and make it part of Israel. And that means the Druze are alone. Already, economically, they're being strangled. And they're dependent on the rest of Syria. They're dependent. They could open a corridor to Jordan and get their food and water and stuff through Jordan, but Jordan has refused to do that, because Jordan wants to be allied with Sharaa, not with the Druze. And so the Druze are, Israel can air fly things in, but ultimately the Druze are dependent on Damascus. And Sharaa, all he has to do is twiddle his thumbs, surround it, and strangle them. It'll be like Gaza. And the Druze will have to submit. And we've seen in the last few days, the tribes, Bedouin tribes, are furious, because tens of thousands of Bedouin were moved out of Suwayda. And they were ready to conquer the whole place, the Bedouin tribes, who had mobilized from all over Syria. It was really an extraordinary show of force, something we've never seen before on the part of the Bedouin. And in many ways, it was a dress rehearsal for what may happen to the Kurds, and the way that the tribes could be mobilized to really pulverize the Kurds in the future, if Turkey and Sharaa wanted to organize it that way.
And now I wonder, what's your take on, what is going to happen from here on with regard to the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, and the Kurds in the northeast, given the failure or the relative failure, if you want to call it that way, of the Sharia government vis-a-vis Suwayda. Do you think that would prompt Sharia to want to take a tougher stance on the Kurds? Because if he didn't, that would make him appear as weak and unable to assert government's control all over Syria, meaning that, we should expect some sort of military campaign by the government and maybe allied tribes in and around the northeast against the SDF and the SDF controlled territory.
Let me turn this around and ask you, because you're probably well tuned in to the Kurdish leadership. If Sharaa plays for time and waits for the Americans to leave, because the Americans are threatening to Kurds that they're going to have to leave at some point, and they've withdrawn from most of their bases around Deir ez-Zor in the Arab regions to up towards Qamishli and Hasaki, which is very bad for the Kurds and for the YPG. But America threatens to withdraw entirely from the region. I don't know if it will, but obviously Sharaa is going to want to find out. Will Mazloum Abdi lay down his arms if that's the case, or will he go to war against Damascus if Damascus tries to mobilize its security forces to use force? What's your understanding of that?
It's a great question. I usually don't answer questions on this show, but I'll take this one.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think, the Kurds are in a very extremely difficult position, and I think they are really playing for time here because, nobody knows what is going to happen in Damascus and whether Sharia's rule is secure. You are a historian of Syria, and you know that history of the military coups very well from early 50s up until late 60s. And so I think one thing that they are waiting for is that as more time goes by, their hands vis-a-vis Damascus might be further strengthened. It is true that the US wants them or is pressuring them at the moment to reach a deal with Damascus, and wants to somehow abandon them in favor of Damascus. But things can change, and in the Middle East there are always really very sort of unexpected scenario that could happen. But I think if push comes to shove, the SDF will quite likely put up a fight, because without that, they will be losing whatever that they have gained. Except if Damascus is really willing with some sort of American and French mediation and Turkish guarantees of some sort, is willing to offer, some sort of a decentralized arrangement to the Kurds. I don't think minus that the SDF will put down their weapons because, Sharaa wants so, or Erdogan wants so, or, the US wants so. And I think, that is going to complicate the whole situation in Syria even further. And, that could pave the way for the entry of other regional actors, such as Iran, pro-Iran groups in Iraq, into Syria again. And, they have been waiting for some sort of an opening. They could not reach the Alawite areas physically. They could not reach the Druze areas, but they can reach the Kurdish controlled areas, by virtue of the physical border that northeast Syria shares with Iraq. And, I think it's not going to be a pretty scenario.
Right. Well, there's that fear of Iranian penetration, but no, it's a very difficult situation, because once Sharaa takes over, if he does take over and tries to force the issue with Turkish backing, and I think Turkey will push him to force the issue eventually, because Turkey doesn't want the YPG to be there. And which puts Sharaa in a bind, because even if he wants to make some deeper compromises, Turkey's not going to be happy with that. Um, and he can always, play the Turkish card. But it would mean if he takes over, the entire Kurdish leadership will have to flee the country. It'll be a little bit like the fall of Afghanistan, where you have people fleeing, right? And America will have to give them citizenship, or somebody will, because they've supported America loyally. And this, adds another factor, which is Congress, because Congress passed in their big, beautiful bill over $100 million for the YPG, for the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, the Qasd. So Congress is quite pro-Kurd, and that's largely because of Israeli influence in Congress and some residual loyalty to the Kurds as this romantic force that's fighting for independence, that's helped America both in Iraq and in Syria and so forth, the fight against ISIS. But though that's usually the face, but it's really about the money behind it. And the money is coming from Israel. And Israel does not want Sharaa to get the Northeast and to drive out the Kurds. So in some ways, the president and the White House is then pitted against Congress in an arm wrestle over this. And I don't think the White House may not want to be responsible for dumping the Kurds and having the flight and having another Afghanistan, a mini Afghanistan, on their hands. So they're pushing the Kurds hard today, but they may not really abandon them. And that's the scenario, I think, that the Kurdish leadership is counting on today, is that Congress, that Israeli support, that international sentiment will somehow keep Sharaa from using force. Because what we saw in the Jebel Druze with the mobilization of the Arab tribes was something I've never seen before. I was really impressed and shocked, because the Arab tribes, for the first time in history, worked as one. And there were 40 some odd Arab tribes that mobilized their people, and they came moving out of the desert, big long convoys overnight with truck after truck after truck full of Bedouin, all saying, we're going to destroy those Druze and their traders and so forth. And here they were, they turned up on the outskirts of Jebel Druze, and they were a force. There were tens of thousands of them, armed. And that's new. Yep.
I agree. I think, one thing that it also does, it pushes the minorities to, opt for a greater degree of mobilization as well, because whether people inside or outside Syria like it or not, that really exposes the sectarian and ethnic fault lines in Syria in a much bolder way, than a lot of people are, willing to admit or would want to see. But, that is only going to push the SDF and the Kurds to, be less and less willing to make any compromises without some serious compromises on the part of Damascus, backed up by some form of guarantee from Washington, European powers, or even ideally Turkey. I think, we both agree that the situation in Syria is really far more complex than, a lot of people might recognize. And it's still also very fluid, both because of the domestic, struggles along various axes and lines, and also, the regional geopolitical reality and the competition and the rivalry that goes on and will go on in some shape and form over Syria. With that, I'll have to bring this episode to an end.
Well, it's a pleasure.
So much Joshua, for your insights today and for helping us unpack such a really complex set of issues. Joshua Landis is an expert on Syrian and Middle Eastern affairs. A quick reminder for our audiences, we have an article on the New Regions website, which I wrote recently about the violence in Suwayda. I've written also about other issues concerning Syria and the region, and you can see those articles on the website. Thank you so much to our audiences for tuning in. We'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode of GeoSpace. Thank you, Joshua.
Mohammed, it was a real pleasure. Great questions and a fun conversation.